Picture a town of 10,000 people, with a kindergarten, a movie theater, a swimming pool, and an indoor skating rink. North of the Arctic Circle, where winter temperatures drop to -50. A town where a miner's salary was 5 times the national average. A town people traveled to for a dream and stayed in for life. Now picture that same town 20 years later. Apartment doors left hanging open. Dishes still on the tables, never cleared away. In the schools, textbooks still open on the desks to the exact page where the lessons simply stopped. Forever. This isn't a movie set for a disaster film. This is a real place. It's called Kadykchan, and today we're going to figure out exactly what happened to it, and why an entire town disappeared in what feels like a single night. Before we talk about how Kadykchan died, we need to understand how it was born. Because this story didn't start with hope. It started with forced labor. The name Kadykchan comes from the Evenki language and translates to small gorge, though there's a darker alternate translation floating around, Valley of Death. The indigenous peoples of the region had long avoided this place. According to local legend, the valley concealed underground lakes that could suddenly burst to the surface at the most unexpected moment. The land was considered cursed. But in 1943, in the middle of the war, a geologist named Vronsky discovered exceptionally high-quality coal in this valley. And the Soviet authorities couldn't have cared less about Evenki legends. This region desperately needed fuel for Kolyma, for the mining operations, for the entire territory. So they built a mine in the Valley of Death. And it wasn't built by free people. Kadykchan began as a work settlement attached to a coal mine, part of the vast Dalstroy system, the Gulag Empire of Kolyma. The mine and the settlement were built by prisoners. Among them was the writer Varlam Shalamov, the same Shalamov who would later describe the Kolyma labor camps in his Kolyma Tales. In his memoirs, he directly names Kadykchan and Arkagala as places where he served his sentence. Coal was extracted through underground shafts reaching depths of up to 400 meters. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the height of the Empire State Building, except underground, in permafrost, north of the Arctic Circle. After Stalin's death, the camp system began to be dismantled, but the settlement remained. More than that, it started to grow. Soviet authorities transformed what had been a place of forced punishment into an ordinary mining town, with one key difference. Now people came here voluntarily, for the money, and the money here really was substantial. At its peak, in the mid-1980s, Kadykchan was home to more than 10,000 people. According to the January 1986 census, the population stood at 10,270. For comparison, that's more than some regional administrative centers on the Russian mainland. A miner's salary in Kadykchan was 5 to 6 times the Soviet average. Specialists came here from across the entire Union, not just for the romance of the North, but for a very practical calculation. A few years of work in Kolyma could earn savings unattainable anywhere else. And the town that received this money developed into something remarkably comfortable for such a harsh corner of the Magadan region. It had a movie theater called Shakhtyr Minor, a cultural center, a library, a sports complex with an indoor swimming pool and covered ice rink, an extraordinary amenity at the time for a settlement located 730 kilometers from Magadan. Laundries and a dry cleaner, hair salons, its own restaurant, a school, kindergartens, a clinic, and eventually even a hospital. The settlement was informally divided into 3 sections that developed in sequence: Old Kadykchan, closest to the highway; New Kadykchan, surrounding mine number 10, the town's economic backbone; and Newest Kadykchan, the main residential zone, set back several kilometers from both the highway and the mine. As newest Kadykchan was built up, the older sections increasingly shifted toward domestic use, greenhouses, garden plots, small-scale livestock keeping. Kadykchan had a second mine too, mine number 7, known locally simply as the 7, but it was mothballed back in 1992, long before the main tragedy. That was the first crack, the first quiet signal that Kolyma's coal era was drawing to a close. Still, in the 1980s, nobody was thinking about that. People here got married, raised children, built careers. One woman who grew up in Kadykchan recalled that her parents met right there, both in their 40s, her father a track and field athlete who worked at the mine, her mother a geologist. Sports were enormously popular in the town. By her account, her parents' first meeting happened literally on a ski trail. This was a full, vibrant, self-sufficient town in the middle of the taiga and permafrost. And almost no one who lived there could have imagined that within 10 or 15 years, nothing would remain of it but silence. The collapse of the Soviet Union hit Kadykchan the same way it hit dozens of other Northern Company towns, but at first, not fatally. The local coal still had value because it powered the Arkagala power plant, the region's main source of electricity. As long as the plant needed fuel, Kadykchan had a reason to exist. The settlement survived perestroika itself and the hardest early years of the new Russia. But 1990s economics wrote its own rules. The value of coal from a remote northern outpost fell sharply for the new state. Extraction was too expensive, logistics too complicated, and a country that had just gone through collapse found it increasingly hard to sustain profitable enterprises in far-flung territories. According to some accounts, authorities had already begun looking for a reason to shut the mine down, even before the tragedy that would ultimately accelerate everything. That tragedy struck on November 23, 1996. At the Kadykchan mine, mine number 10, the same one that anchored the town's economy. A methane explosion tore through the shaft. 6 miners were killed. It wasn't the first or the largest tragedy in the history of Kolyma's coal mines. Methane explosions in deep coal shafts have, tragically, happened before and since. But this particular explosion became the point of no return for the entire town. The commission that arrived on site declared the mine unprofitable and unsafe to continue operating. The decision was made to shut it down. For an ordinary town, losing a single enterprise is a heavy blow, but a survivable one. Kadykchan, however, was not an ordinary town. It was a company town in the purest sense of the word. Its entire economy, its entire way of life, rested on a single mine. When the mine stopped, the town's heart stopped with it. People began to leave. Slowly at first, those who had somewhere to go and something to leave with. Authorities began paying relocation compensation, ranging from 80,000 to 120,000 rubles, depending on a resident's length of service. It was an official admission. This town was no longer going to exist. But the worst was still ahead, and it happened not in summer, but in the depths of a brutal northern winter. Picture the conditions for a moment. The Magadan region, winter, temperatures outside dropping to -40. Now picture the heat in every building suddenly disappearing. That's exactly what happened in Kadykchan during the winter of 2000 to 2001. The settlement's single boiler house suffered a breakdown. Central heating, and these were genuinely well-appointed multi-story apartment buildings with central heat, not some barracks, simply vanished. In the depths of -40-degree cold. For a town already losing population after the mine's closure, this was the final verdict. People who had still been hesitating about whether to leave stopped hesitating. Staying meant risking freezing to death, literally. Here's a detail that's essential to understanding why Kadykchan's story is so unsettling. People had no time to pack. This wasn't immigration that stretches over months, where a family gradually gathers belongings, sells off property, plans the move. This was an evacuation under crisis conditions. Furniture, books, dishes, toys, all of it was often simply left behind, because only the bare essentials could be carried out, and transportation out of such a remote location was severely limited. That's precisely why Kadykchan became the Kadykchan we know today from photographs. A town where closets still stand full of clothes in the apartments, where dishes still sit on kitchen counters, where cars rust away in garages, where toys still litter children's bedrooms, and where even potty training seats remain in bathrooms. The town didn't empty out gradually and neatly. It was abandoned in panic and haste. In 2001, authorities officially mothballed the buildings, cutting off heat and electricity for good. But even then, Kadykchan wasn't entirely dead yet, for streets remained inhabited. Lennon Street, Builders Street, School Street, home to the automatic telephone exchange, and South Street, the building farthest from the center. One more building, on Mira Street, long remained a lone point of continued life. It housed a clinic, later a hospital, along with utility services. But this was no longer a town. It was scattered islands of people in a sea of empty stairwells. The most remarkable and saddest part of this story is just how long and slowly life in Kadykchan continued to fade, even after it had already been officially declared unfit for habitation. According to the 2002 census, the settlement still counted 875 residents. By unofficial estimates, in 2006 that number stood at around 791. People clung to their homes even as empty apartment blocks stood all around them, without heat, without light, without any functioning infrastructure. By 2009 to 2010, the population had shrunk to a mere handful, by various accounts, down to around 200, and then to just a few dozen residents. By 2010, according to some sources, the settlement had just 2 of the most stubborn residents left, people who simply refused to accept that the town was finished. And this is where the story takes on an almost cinematic quality. Italian traveler Clemente Perazza, who visited Kadykchan in 2012, reported that one person was still living there, an elderly man. By other accounts, this man lived in the dead town with 2 dogs, literally alone amid abandoned 5-story apartment blocks, in a frozen, looted, state-forgotten settlement. Think about that for a moment. A man who lived alone, for years, in the middle of a ghost town north of the Arctic Circle. No neighbors, no shops, no central heating or electricity. Surrounded by empty apartments where other people's furniture still stood and other people's books still sat on the shelves. This isn't just a story about a mind closing anymore. It's a story about how powerfully a person can remain attached to a place, even after that place has officially ceased to exist. According to official statistics, Kadykchan's population in 2023 stood at exactly 1 person. Though there is also evidence that in certain years, 2021, for instance, that number briefly rose to a handful, likely due to temporary presence. Hunters, workers, or occasional occupants of the buildings closest to the highway. Today, Kadykchan is officially classified as an abandoned urban-type settlement. Not formally dissolved on paper, it technically still exists, but functionally dead. What physically happened to Kadykchan over these 20-plus years has made it one of the most famous destinations for stalkers, urbex explorers, and photographers drawn to post-apocalyptic aesthetics anywhere in Russia. Kadykchan sits directly on the Kolyma Highway, the legendary Road of Bones connecting Magadan and Yakutsk. That means the town doesn't need to be sought out somewhere deep in the wilderness. It's literally visible from the road, a road still traveled today by trucks and travelers alike. That accessibility is exactly why Kadykchan has become one of the most visited and most photographed ghost towns in Russia. So what can you actually see there now? 5-story apartment blocks with shattered windows, gradually crumbling under repeated freeze-thaw cycles. Water seeps into cracks in the concrete, freezes, expands, and after 20 winters the concrete panels simply disintegrate. Inside the apartments, abandoned furniture, closets full of clothing long since covered in frost and mold, books still on the shelves, toys, children's drawings still taped to the walls. Inside the former cultural center stands a rotting piano, arguably the single most iconic image associated with Kadykchan, a black instrument sitting amid shattered glass and crumbling plaster. An image that has traveled across the internet and become the visual signature of dozens of videos about this place. In the school, classrooms with textbooks still open on the desks, chalkboards still bearing the date that became, permanently, the school's last day. In the kindergarten, tiny chairs, toys, coloring books. The climate here is the harshest and most relentless artist of this decay. The seasonal temperature swing exceeds 80 degrees Celsius between summer and winter. That destroys buildings far faster than it would in abandoned towns with a temperate climate, Pripyat, for instance. In that sense, Kadykchan is a fast-forwarded version of civilizational collapse, something nature is demonstrating in mere decades instead of centuries. That's exactly what draws tourists, and also what makes visiting genuinely dangerous. Unstable ceilings, collapsed stairwells, exposed sharp metal, hidden holes in the flooring. All standard hazards for anyone who decides to wander through these abandoned buildings without proper preparation. Kadykchan isn't a unique case. It's one of dozens, if not hundreds, of abandoned company towns across the former USSR whose entire existence was tied to a single enterprise. When the enterprise died, the town died with it. But Kadykchan stands out from that list in two ways. First, its speed. Most abandoned towns empty out over years, gradually, family by family. Kadykchan lost its heart in the span of just a few years, from the mine explosion in 1996 to the boiler house failure in 2000 to 2001. This wasn't a slow fade. It was an abrupt, almost shocking interruption of an entire town's life. Second, how vividly the human trace remains visible inside the abandoned apartments. Not 50 years after World War II, not through some fictional civilizational collapse, but literally within a single generation, in real time, an entire town turned into a museum of itself. With books still on the shelves, toys still on the floor, and a piano that will never play another note. Kadykchan is a reminder of how fragile an entire community can be when its existence depends on a single mine, a single factory, a single decision made by someone far away. And a reminder of how quickly silence can swallow a place where, only yesterday, children were laughing and music was playing. Every abandoned place eventually collects its own folklore, and Kadykchan is no exception. In fact, its unsettling backstory, a valley of death cursed by the people who lived there long before the Soviets ever arrived, turned out to be the perfect seed for decades of rumor and legend. Locals in nearby Susamin and Sinagori have long told stories about strange sounds coming from the empty apartment blocks at night. wind moving through broken windows and stairwells that some visitors swear sounds almost like voices. There are accounts of Geiger counter-carrying tourists insisting they picked up unusual readings near the old mine shafts. Though no credible source has ever documented actual radioactive contamination in Kadykchan, the mine produced coal, not uranium, and the claims appear to be confused with stories about entirely different Kolyma sites. A more grounded legend, though, is the one about the underground lakes the Evenki people warned of centuries ago. Geologists confirm that the region genuinely does sit above pockets of groundwater trapped beneath permafrost, and localized flooding has occasionally been reported in Kolyma mining operations more broadly. Whether or not this specific phenomenon ever threatened Kadykchan directly is difficult to verify, but it's easy to see how a real geological quirk could calcify, over generations, into a story about a cursed valley that swallows the people who settle it. Then there's the human mythology, the stories that grew around the mine explosion itself. In the retelling that circulates among Kolyma old-timers, the 1996 disaster is sometimes framed not as an accident, but as the final, inevitable outcome of a mine that had been quietly deteriorating for years, with safety concerns raised and ignored long before the methane blast. Whether that's historical accuracy or the kind of narrative tidiness that memory imposes on tragedy after the fact is hard to say for certain, but it's a detail nearly every longtime Kadykchan resident brings up when asked about that day to really understand what makes Kadykchan distinct. It helps to place it next to the other abandoned settlements scattered across the former Soviet North and Far East. Because Kadykchan is far from alone. Not far away, along the same Kolyma Highway, sits Sinagori and several smaller Kolyma settlements that have also lost most of their population as the mining industry that sustained them collapsed. Farther west, in the Vorkuta region of the Russian Arctic, entire coal mining suburbs, Yurshur, Komaryu, Kapitalnaya, followed almost the exact same trajectory as Kadykchan. Soviet-era company towns built around a single resource, abandoned within a decade of the USSR's collapse once that resource stopped being profitable to extract. What sets Kadykchan apart from most of these is documentation. Because it sits directly on a highway still used by travelers, and because of how visually striking the decay is, the piano, the school, the rows of pastel Soviet apartment blocks slowly being swallowed by birch saplings growing through the pavement. Kadykchan has become the reference point, the poster child, of the post-Soviet Arctic ghost town in a way that more remote, harder-to-reach settlements like Komaryu never quite achieved, despite similarly tragic histories. There's also a meaningful contrast with the world's most famous ghost town, Pripyat, near Chernobyl. Pripyat was evacuated in a single, sudden event, a nuclear disaster, and has remained frozen in that exact 1986 moment ever since, preserved partly by the surrounding exclusion zone that keeps looters and casual visitors largely out. Kadykchan had no such protection. Its decline took years rather than hours, which meant looters, scrap metal scavengers, and casual visitors had far more time to strip the town of anything valuable. Copper wiring, radiators, anything metal worth hauling out. What's left in Kadykchan today isn't so much a snapshot of one specific day, the way Pripyat is, but the accumulated residue of a slow, decade-long unraveling. If this story has made you curious enough to actually consider visiting, and Kadykchan does draw a steady trickle of urbex tourists and photographers every year, a few practical realities are worth knowing. The town sits directly off the Kolyma Highway between Susamin and Yagodnoy, in one of the most remote and sparsely populated regions on Earth. There's no tourist infrastructure whatsoever. No ticket booth, no guide, no safety barriers. Anyone visiting is entirely on their own, and cell service along large stretches of the highway is unreliable at best. The buildings themselves are now dangerously unstable. Roughly a quarter century of freeze-thaw cycles has left staircases with missing steps, floors with rotted-through sections, and ceilings that have already partially collapsed in several buildings. Local guides and experienced Kolyma travelers generally recommend against entering any building whose structural condition can't be clearly assessed from outside, and against visiting alone, given how far the nearest help would be in an emergency. The climate adds its own layer of risk. Even in summer, weather in this part of Magadan Oblast can shift rapidly, and winter travel on the Kolyma Highway is genuinely hazardous, with long unlit, unserviced stretches between settlements. Most visitors who make the trip do so in the short summer window, typically arriving as part of a broader trip along the Road of Bones rather than a dedicated expedition to Kadykchan alone. Today, if you drive the Kolyma Highway from Magadan toward Yakutsk, you can pull over right off the road and walk into Kadykchan. No one guards the gates. No one will stop you at the entrance. The town simply stands there, empty, frozen, silent, waiting for nature to finish what people started more than 20 years ago. If you enjoyed this video, hit like. It genuinely helps the channel. And subscribe if you want more stories about places that once lived and now exist only in silence and in photographs. Let me know in the comments, which abandoned town should we cover next? Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.